We've learned a lot about corridors in a very short period of time, but the last look at corridors that we're going to do is taking advantage of another means to create a corridor boundary. And the reason why is because at times our corridors create islands. Now let's see that in our exercise, 0809 corridor boundary. In our last exercise, we added the intersection here near the top. These intersections were already drawn in, our cul-de-sacs are done, but notice the island that is created here. Because the outer boundary still is in place, but that outer boundary applies to all of this information here. This is inside the surface. We need to create a hide boundary. And so what we're going to do is we're going to create a hide boundary that is interactive inside this area. Interactive because it's connected to the corridor itself. If the corridor changes in slope on the side for the daylight, width, all of these different things, our hide boundary will adjust as well. Because we're editing the corridor or components connected to it, we're going to select the corridor. We're going to go to the corridor surfaces in the contextual ribbon, modify corridor panel, and choose boundaries. Now we added an outside boundary already, but we can add another boundary by right-clicking. In this case, we're going to add an interactive boundary. The interactive boundary really is going to take advantage of the codes that are associated to the feature lines that are drawn. In this case, we're going to use the interactive boundary connected to the daylight codes here. And so I'm going to select somewhere around here, and it's going to pick up and say, well, where you picked are all of these different types of codes. And we're going to select the daylight, and then it begins to draw a line following the daylight along that region. When the region ends, I can't pull that preview any farther, I go ahead and pick again. And so I'm going to pick there, and then I pick the next region. It says, all right, there is another code. We'll just keep following the daylight. So it ends that region. I pick again and go to the next region, daylight. Now here's the interesting thing. There's a small little region in there from the intersection object. And so we're just going to have to pick a few times to get along the main road here. It seems a little bit painful, but the nice thing is once we do it, it's all interactive and interconnected to the corridor object. And so I get near this region here, and I'm just going to go ahead and pick, and then get on the region connected to the curve. There we go. Once that little window pops up, I know I'm good. At daylight, and I'm following the curve here until the curve ends. Pick the end of the curve, and pick the next section here. And just keep panning along as it follows that alignment all the way down until I get near the intersection, and pick to end it and begin the curve region. It follows the curve region until the end here, and I'm just going to pick the end there. And before I pick another one, notice the options. I can pick another point, or I can just say close. And so we're going to have this little section here just follow from this point to this point. So we're going to go ahead and close. Takes me back and says, all right, you have the other boundary. Here's all the definitions. The definitions, whatever the software has, but these are all the points it picked and graphically walked us through. What we're looking for, though, is not an outside boundary, but a hide boundary. We go ahead and click OK. Now we have a very clean surface with an outside boundary and then a hide boundary where our corridor may have created an island. So again, we've covered a lot about corridors. We've looked at corridors being connected to linear paths, alignments and profiles, or feature lines, as well as assemblies. Assemblies being made of subassemblies, subassemblies being made of points, links, and shapes. We've created a surface connected to our corridor. The surface was created using links and the code associated to those links. We targeted not only the surface for daylighting, but the width for adding a taper. Then we took that idea of targeting and completely flipped on what we would consider normal and did not follow the center line or the baseline. But when our design began to diverge from being perpendicular from the baseline, we created another baseline that targeted back. And that's what we saw with our corridor cul-de-sac. That same mentality or thought is what we apply to our intersection object, letting the software, Civil 3D, deal with all the minutia of getting the right profiles and elevations for the alignments and so forth, or the alignments drawn, the correct elevations for the profiles and so forth. But ultimately the same concept as what we did with a corridor cul-de-sac. We changed the baseline to follow along the curb return, and then we target the alignments along that edge. So really a lot that you can do with corridors. And we go back with the intent and reminder that a lot has to do with being creative in our approach to creating our assemblies.